The letter fell from Clara Brenner's 12-year-old fingers and fluttered to the dusty floorboards like a wounded bird, and she pressed both hands over her mouth to hold in the sound that wanted to escape her, a sound too large and too broken for a girl her age to contain. Her eyes were wet, her shoulders shaking, and she stood in the middle of her father's study in the fading amber light of a September afternoon in 1882, surrounded by 4 months of unopened correspondence stacked in a crate near the window, and she simply wept. Clayton Brenner heard her from the barn. He had not heard his daughter cry since the funeral, not once. Not even at the graveside when the preacher spoke over Margaret's pine box and half of Caldwell, Kansas had gathered to press their dry, sun-cracked hands against his daughter's small shoulders. Clara had stood like a stone that day, and Clayton had stood like a stone beside her, and they had both turned to stone together, and neither of them had cracked since. Until now. He came through the back door of the ranch house with hay still clinging to his shirt, one boot half unlaced, and he found her standing over the fallen letter with her whole small body trembling. He crossed the room in 4 long strides and dropped to one knee in front of her. "Clara." His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by months of near silence. "Clara, what is it?" She could not answer. She only pointed at the letter on the floor, and then she swept one arm toward the entire crate, toward 4 months of unopened envelopes still sealed, still patient, still waiting with their secrets locked inside them, and then she turned and ran to her room, and the sound of her bedroom door latching was the loneliest sound Clayton Brenner had heard since the dirt hit the lid of his wife's coffin. He stood alone in the study for a long moment. He looked at the letter on the floor. He looked at the crate. He had not touched that crate in 4 months for the same reason he had not touched Margaret's side of the wardrobe, for the same reason he had let the vegetable garden go to ruin, for the same reason he rose at 4 in the morning every day and drove himself into the ground with physical labor until he fell into unconscious sleep each night. If he stopped moving, the grief would swallow him whole. If he opened a letter, he would have to admit that life was still continuing out there beyond the ranch boundaries, that the world had not paused when Margaret died, and that was a truth he had not been ready to face. But his daughter had wept, and that changed everything. He bent and picked up the letter from the floor. The handwriting on the front was not familiar. It was careful, elegant script, the kind that came from someone who had been taught to write with proper attention. The postmark read Abilene, Kansas, dated May 14, 1882. The envelope was addressed to him personally. Clayton sank into the leather chair behind his desk, the one his father had shipped from Missouri 30 years ago, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, though no one had smoked in this house for years. He turned the letter over. The seal was broken. Clara had opened it. He unfolded the single sheet inside and began to read. The letter was from a woman named Lillian Barrett. She wrote with a directness that surprised him. No excessive pleasantries, no meandering preamble, just a clear, honest voice that came through the paper and sat across from him like a person. She wrote that she had seen his advertisement in the Abilene Daily Chronicle, that she was 31 years of age, a schoolteacher currently employed at the Abilene Academy for Young Ladies, that she was not looking for rescue and was not offering convenience. She wrote that she had read his notice 3 times before deciding to respond, and that something in the plainness of his wording had spoken to her. He had written, she noted, that he was a widower with a daughter, that he owned a working cattle ranch outside of Caldwell, and that he was looking for a companion, not a servant. She had appreciated that distinction enormously. She wrote that she had her own past to navigate, that she had been engaged once, and the engagement had ended in a manner that had taken her some time to recover from, and that she was not interested in pretending she was without history or without opinions. She had dark hair and gray eyes, and she was told she could be too direct for some people's tastes, but she thought honesty was more useful than charm. She had signed it, Lillian Barrett, with an address in Abilene, And then, in a postscript at the bottom, in smaller letters, she had written, "I should tell you that I am not writing out of desperation, but out of genuine curiosity about the kind of man who would write an advertisement with more dignity than most write their Sunday sermons. I hope this letter finds you well, Mr. Brenner. I hope your daughter is doing all right." Children who have lost a mother carry a particular kind of quiet, and I imagine she carries hers with more strength than you can always see. Clayton read that postscript 3 times. Then he set the letter down on the desk and stared at the wall for a while. She had written about Clara without knowing Clara, had understood something about her from a single line in a newspaper advertisement, and she had been right. Exactly, precisely, undeniably right. He pulled the crate toward him. He began opening letters. There were 22 of them. Most were ordinary, bills from the feed supplier in Wichita, a notice about the county land registry, a letter from his brother in St. Louis asking after his well-being in the stiff, slightly guilty way his brother always communicated since he had chosen not to come to the funeral. There were a few advertisements, a pamphlet from a cattle brokerage, a notice about a church revival. And there were 3 more letters from Lillian Barrett. He opened them in order by postmark. The second letter, dated June 3rd, was shorter. She wrote that she had not expected a reply quickly, that she understood a man managing a ranch was not a man who had abundant leisure, but that she had found herself thinking about his advertisement again and had wanted to write once more before deciding whether to contact anyone else. She mentioned that she had been reading to her students the works of Emerson, that she found the ideas about self-reliance both inspiring and occasionally exhausting, that she had been attempting to grow tomatoes in the small yard behind her rented room in Abilene, and they had developed some kind of blight. She wrote about the tomatoes with a dry humor that made Clayton almost smile, the first almost smile he had felt in months. She closed by saying she hoped she had not been forward and that she understood completely if he had decided to pursue other correspondences. The third letter, dated July 18th, was longer and noticeably different in tone. The careful politeness had given way to something more genuine and more troubled. She wrote that she had almost not written again, that she had told herself firmly to stop writing to a man who clearly had no interest in responding, but that something had compelled her to try once more. She wrote that she had recently discovered the man she had been engaged to, a man named Gerald Voss, who was now a land speculator operating out of Wichita, had been spreading a particular story about why their engagement had ended, a story that cast her in a very poor light, a story that was not true. She wrote that she did not want to burden a stranger with this, but that she was writing it down because she needed to say it somewhere outside her own head. Gerald Voss had ended the engagement, not her. He had done so because a more advantageous match had presented itself, a wealthy rancher's daughter from Dodge City, and he had chosen money over the woman he had claimed to love, and then had told everyone in Abilene that Lillian had broken his heart and was, in his exact words, impossible to live with. She had lost 2 teaching positions as a result of the gossip, though she had since secured a 3rd position and was rebuilding her reputation with the particular grim determination she had discovered she possessed in abundance. She wrote, "I am telling you this because I believe you deserve to know the full picture of who you might be corresponding with, and because I am tired of carrying this secret alone. I understand completely if this letter changes your estimation of me. It would be reasonable for it to do so. But I would rather be known honestly than pleasantly." Clayton set that letter down very carefully, as though it were fragile. He had spent 4 months not opening his mail, not engaging with the world, not allowing himself to be known by anyone or to know anyone, and here was a woman who had written to him 3 times in the face of total silence, who had become more honest with each letter precisely because he had not responded, as though the absence of response had somehow freed her to be more fully herself. He opened the 4th letter. It was dated September 1st, 13 days ago. It was the letter Clara had opened, and now he understood why his daughter had wept. Lillian Barrett wrote, "Mr. Brenner, I am writing this final letter with no expectation of reply. I have come to understand that you are either not interested in correspondence of this kind, or that something has happened which has prevented you from responding, or that you are simply a man so deep in grief that no letter from a stranger could reach you right now. I understand all three possibilities. I am a practical woman, and I release you from any imagined obligation with complete sincerity. But I want you to know this, in case you ever do read this letter. I have not regretted writing to you. In writing to you these past several months, I have written some of the most honest things I have ever written, perhaps because your silence felt safe, perhaps because I sensed that you, too, were someone who was navigating something enormous, and that even if you never read these words, they needed to be said. You wrote in your advertisement that you were looking for a companion. I have found, strangely, that writing to you has felt like companionship, even in one direction only, even in silence. I hope your ranch is doing well. I hope your cattle are fat and your fields are good. I hope your daughter is learning to laugh again, because children who stop laughing become adults who never quite know how to start. I wish you every good thing, Clayton Brenner, even from this distance, even as a stranger. Yours with sincere respect and no expectations, Lillian Barrett." Clayton sat with that letter in his hands for a very long time. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the buffalo grass and set the windmill spinning in the blue dusk, and the cattle settled in the west pasture, and somewhere in the house his daughter was still in her room, and the world was very quiet and very large. He folded the letter carefully and placed it with the other three. Then he went to Clara's door and knocked. She opened it with red-rimmed eyes and looked up at him with the specific expression she wore when she was trying to be braver than she felt, which he recognized because he wore the same expression himself every single day. "I read them," he said. Clara searched his face. All four, all four. Something shifted in his daughter's expression. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of possibility, which was perhaps more valuable than relief at that particular moment. "She sounds like she would be kind," Clara said carefully. "I thought she sounded kind, even in just the one I read." "She does," Clayton agreed. Clara looked at her father with 12 years of sharp observation behind her eyes. "Are you going to write back to her?" Clayton Brenner looked at his daughter and thought about a woman in Abilene who grew blighted tomatoes and taught her students Emerson and carried her truth like a weapon and a shield at the same time. A woman who had written 4 letters into silence and kept becoming more honest with each one. "Yes," he said, "I think I am." He had not written a personal letter in years. The last one he had written was to Margaret's mother after the funeral. A formal, careful letter that had cost him 2 hours of sitting motionless before he could find a single word. He sat at his desk after Clara had gone to bed and opened the ink pot and held the pen for a considerable time before he wrote anything. He wrote, "Miss Barrett, I owe you an apology of significant proportions." Then he stopped and crossed that out and started again. He wrote, "Miss Barrett, my name is Clayton Brenner. I know you know my name. What I mean is that I am attempting to introduce myself as though for the first time, because it seems to me that whoever received your letters these past 4 months was not quite a whole person, and I would like to offer you the version of me that has just spent an hour reading 4 letters and finding himself thoroughly unsettled by each one." He sat back and looked at what he had written. It was not dignified, but it was true. He kept it. He wrote for an hour. He told her about Margaret, not the grief details, not the funeral details, but the fact of her. A woman who had loved this ranch and this land with a fierceness that still lived in every fence post and every window frame, who had died of a fever in the spring, while the wildflowers were just coming up, which Clayton considered a particular cruelty on the part of the universe. He told her that he had not opened his mail in 4 months, because opening it would have meant acknowledging that time was still moving. He told her his daughter was named Clara and was 12 and read every book she could find and had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and was currently the best and most difficult person he knew. He told her that he had read her 4 letters and wanted her to know that she had been correct about his daughter, that Clara carried her quiet with enormous strength, and that the observation had done something to him that he could not entirely explain. He told her that he understood about Gerald Voss, at least the outline of it, and that a man who made himself look larger by making someone else look smaller was the particular kind of small man that Clayton had no time for. He told her that he would understand if she had moved on entirely, that 4 months was a long time, and she was clearly a woman of too much sense to wait indefinitely for a man who could not open his mail, but that if she had not moved on entirely, he would very much like to continue corresponding. He signed it, Clayton Brenner, Brenner Ranch, Caldwell, Kansas. He sealed it and set it on the corner of the desk where he would see it in the morning and could decide whether to actually send it or throw it in the stove. In the morning, he sent it. The weeks that followed were strange and uncomfortable and quietly wonderful. He had forgotten what it felt like to wait for something. He had spent 4 months trying to feel nothing, to keep his head below the surface of time, and now he found himself watching for the mail rider with an attention he had not applied to anything except work in months. Clara noticed. Of course Clara noticed. "You are watching the road again," she said at breakfast one morning, not accusatory, just observational, in the dry tone she had inherited directly from him. "I am watching the road because there are cattle in the south field that have been getting too close to the fence line," he said. "The cattle are in the north field," Clara said. Clayton poured his coffee and said nothing. Clara allowed herself a very small smile over the rim of her own cup, which she was not supposed to be drinking, but he had stopped arguing about it 3 weeks ago because she made it herself while he slept, and there was something in her independence that reminded him too much of Margaret to correct. The reply came on the 14th day. He read it at the kitchen table while Clara pretended not to watch from the doorway. Lillian Barrett wrote, "Mr. Brenner, I will be honest with you because I find I cannot be otherwise, at least not in writing, which is perhaps a peculiarity of mine. When your letter arrived, I sat with it unopened for 20 minutes, because I had told myself firmly that I had made my peace with the silence, and that reopening this correspondence would only prove that I had not. Then I opened it, and I read it 3 times, and I made myself a cup of tea that I forgot to drink, and I read it a 4th time. I'm not moved on entirely. I appreciate your honesty about your wife and your daughter, and the 4 months of unopened mail more than I can properly express. I appreciate that you did not try to make yourself sound better than you were or softer than you were or more ready than you were. I have had enough of men who perform the version of themselves they think women want to see." She wrote about her life in more detail this time. She had grown up in Topeka, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Lillian was 16, which she mentioned briefly and without sentimentality, though Clayton felt the weight of it clearly. She had put herself through teachers' college through a combination of scholarships and working as a seamstress on weekends, which she had hated but done thoroughly because she did not believe in doing things halfway. She had come to Abilene 3 years ago for the teaching position, had met Gerald Voss at a church social within a year, had believed herself to be in love for a period of about 14 months, and had then spent the following year unwrapping herself from that belief layer by layer like a person unwrapping bandages, which was uncomfortable but ultimately necessary. She wrote that she had 3 plants on her windowsill, an asparagus fern which was thriving, a succulent of unknown origin which was simply enduring, and the tomato plant which she had brought inside from the yard in a final act of either optimism or stubbornness, and which had produced exactly 1 tomato, small and slightly lopsided, which she had eaten with salt on a Tuesday afternoon and declared a personal victory. Clayton read that paragraph about the tomato and laughed out loud. Clara came fully into the room. "You laughed," she said. "The woman grew a tomato," he said, and showed his daughter the letter. Clara read it with the total focused attention she gave everything, and when she looked up her face was different, more open, less careful, the face she wore before the world had asked her to be careful about everything. "She is funny," Clara said, "and a little bit sad, but in the way that people are sad when they have decided to be okay about it." Clayton looked at his daughter. "When did you get so old?" he asked. "4 months ago," Clara said quietly and went back to the kitchen. They wrote back and forth for 6 weeks. The letters grew longer and more detailed and less guarded with each exchange. Lillian told him about her students, about the particular joy of watching a child unlock reading, about the frustration of a school board that thought girls needed less education than boys, about a colleague named Mrs. Hartley who brought extraordinary apple cake to the staff room every Friday and was otherwise entirely insufferable. Clayton told her about the cattle operation, about the particular satisfaction of a good branding season, about the way the land changed through the year, about a neighboring rancher named Pete Alderson, who was the best neighbor a man could have and also borrowed tools without ever returning them, about the slow work of repairing the south fence line, about Clara's reading, about the way Clara sometimes set 2 cups at the breakfast table out of habit and then stood with the extra cup in her hand for a moment before putting it back in the cupboard. He had not meant to write that last part. It had come out of the pen before he had decided to say it, and he looked at it on the paper for a moment, then left it in. Lillian wrote back about it. She wrote, "I think the extra cup is the most honest thing you have told me. I think the places where grief lives are never where we expect them." In the 5th week of letters, he asked if she would consider coming to Caldwell. He spent 3 days composing that single question, circling it in his head, working it from different angles, asking himself whether it was too soon, and then whether the calendar year had any bearing at all on a correspondence that had already been more honest than most marriages he had observed. He wrote the question plainly. "Miss Barrett, I recognize this may be previous to what you were expecting, but I find myself increasingly interested in you as a person rather than a correspondent, and I wonder if you would consider visiting Caldwell to meet in person, with no obligations implied in either direction, and with the full understanding that you would be welcome to form your own opinion and depart on whatever schedule suited you." Lillian's reply came back in 9 days, and he waited those 9 days with a particular, specific, low-grade anxiety that he had not felt since before Margaret died, since the early days when he had been a younger man and the world had still had the capacity to surprise him. She wrote, "I have thought about this carefully. I will come to Caldwell." She named a date. The 15th of November, 1882. She would arrive on the afternoon stage from Abilene. Clayton read that line and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. He told Clara at dinner. Clara set down her fork with enormous care. "She is coming here, on the 15th of November. Clara sat with this for exactly 3 seconds. "I am going to make sure the guest room is clean," she announced, and pushed back her chair with great purpose. "Clara," Clayton said. She looked back at him. "Do not terrify her." "I would not terrify her," Clara said, with the specific dignity of someone who was absolutely considering terrifying her. The days between that letter and November 15th moved with the maddening dual nature of time that Clayton remembered from waiting in general, too slow and too fast simultaneously, each day dragging through its hours, and yet the calendar pages turning with inexplicable speed. He worked the ranch hard, which he always did, but now there was a different quality to the work, less like drowning himself and more like building something, which was a distinction he did not examine too closely in case it dissolved. He repaired the front porch steps, which had been loose since spring. He had Clara help him decide where to put fresh wildflowers from the remaining fall blooms in the house, a consultation she took extremely seriously. He argued with Pete Alderson about the borrowed fence tools and got half of them back, which Alderson considered a generous settlement. He wrote one last letter to Lillian before her arrival, a short one, just saying that they were looking forward to her coming and that Clara had cleaned the guest room to a standard he believed bordered on military. The 15th of November arrived with gray skies and a cold Kansas wind that smelled like winter coming. Clayton drove the wagon to town himself. Clara had asked to come, and he had considered it, then told her to wait at the ranch because 2 Brenners descending on the stage depot simultaneously might constitute an ambush. Clara had agreed, reluctantly, and had then immediately stationed herself at the window with a clear view of the road. The afternoon stage from Abilene arrived at 10 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, pulling up in front of Caldwell's Main Street in a cloud of dust, and the particular racket of coach springs and horse hooves that was one of the defining sounds of the era. Clayton stood beside his wagon with his hat in his hands, which was not a thing he typically did, and he watched the stage door open. He had imagined this moment during the weeks of letters, had tried not to imagine it too concretely, because he was not a man given to romantic fantasy, but he had imagined it in the spare, involuntary way that happens when you cannot entirely control your own mind at 3 in the morning. Lillian Barrett stepped down from the stage. She was of medium height with dark hair pinned under a practical brown traveling hat, wearing a wool coat the color of pine needles over a dark dress that had clearly traveled well because she was the kind of woman who packed sensibly. She had gray eyes, as she had written, and they moved quickly around the depot before they found him, which they did with a directness that matched every letter she had ever sent him. They looked at each other across 10 feet of dusty Caldwell Street. She was not precisely what he had imagined, and she was entirely what he had expected, which was a paradox he could not explain but felt completely. "Mr. Brenner," she said, and her voice was clear and low and slightly roughened by the journey. "Miss Barrett," he said, "welcome to Caldwell." There was a brief pause in which they both assessed the distance between the people they had been in letters and the people who were now standing in actual physical space, and then Lillian Barrett smiled, a real smile, cautious and genuine at once, and said, "I see you found your mail." He laughed, and she looked surprised by his laugh, and he thought that was fair because he was somewhat surprised by it himself. And then he moved forward to take her traveling bag, and she let him, and they walked to the wagon together in the cold November wind. The drive out to the ranch took 40 minutes on the main road, which gave them time to move from the careful distance of strangers who had only written to each other into something that more closely resembled the people they had been on paper. She asked about the land, genuinely curious, turning to look at the buffalo grass and the thin tree line along the creek, and the wide sky that was doing its particular Kansas thing of being everywhere at once. He told her about the property, the acreage, the cattle count, the history of the house which his father had built and he had expanded twice. "Your father built it," she said. "My father came out from Missouri in 1851 with my mother and $800 and the absolute conviction that Kansas was going to be something," Clayton said. He was right, though it took longer than he expected and was more complicated than he wanted. "Most good things are," Lillian said, and looked at the road ahead. When they came up the drive to the ranch house, Clara was not at the window. She was standing on the front porch with her hands folded in front of her, in a posture of deliberate composure that Clayton recognized as having cost her significant effort. He pulled the wagon to a stop and helped Lillian down and watched his daughter look at this woman with those careful, Margaret bright eyes. "You must be Clara," Lillian said. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "Your father has written about you a great deal," Lillian said. "He is very proud of you." Clara looked quickly at her father, who had apparently failed to mention this in his own communications with her, and then back at Lillian. "He did not tell me that," she said. "Men generally do not," Lillian said, in a tone so dry and so companionable that Clara's composure cracked at the edges and something bright came through. "Come inside," Clara said. "I have made coffee. I also made biscuits, but they are not as good as the coffee." "I love biscuits," Lillian said, "especially honest ones." They went inside together, the 3 of them, and the ranch house was warm from the stove and smelled of wood smoke and coffee and Clara's attempted biscuits, and Clayton stood in the doorway for a moment after the two of them had gone in, looking back at the gray November sky, and felt the particular sensation of something beginning. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both tentative and natural, the way a new melody feels when you are still learning its intervals. Lillian slept in the guest room, which Clara had indeed prepared to an impressive standard. She ate breakfast at the table with them and helped Clara with the dishes without being asked. She walked the property with Clayton on the second morning, asking questions about the cattle operation with genuine interest, not performed interest, and she had clearly done some reading about ranching beforehand because her questions were specific and practical. "You researched cattle before coming?" he asked, after she asked a particularly pointed question about winter feed costs. "I am a teacher," she said. "I do not visit a subject unprepared." "You researched me," he said, not making it an accusation, just noticing. She looked at him sideways as they walked the fence line, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "I researched the industry," she said. "I did not need to research you. You wrote me 4 letters." "You wrote me 4 letters," he corrected. "I wrote you 3. 4, she said. The silence was also a letter. He stopped walking. She walked another 2 steps and then stopped and turned to look at him, and the wind was moving her dark hair against her cheek, and the Kansas sky was enormous above them, and he looked at her and thought about 4 months of unopened mail, and a daughter who wept over a stranger's letter, and a grief that had been trying to fossilize him from the inside out. "That is an extraordinary thing to say," he told her. She looked at him steadily. "I mean it. The silence told me something. I did not know what exactly, but I wrote toward it anyway because it felt like writing toward a person rather than an absence." She paused. "I do not know if that makes sense." "It makes complete sense," he said. They stood at the fence line with the cattle moving in the field beyond it and the cold wind between them, and something passed between them that was not yet named, but was entirely present. That evening, after Clara had gone to bed with one of her books and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, Clayton and Lillian sat at the kitchen table with the oil lamp between them and talked for 3 hours. This was different from letters. Letters had structure, the time to compose, to reconsider, to choose words with deliberate care. This was something more exposed, her face in the lamplight, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, the way she occasionally looked away when she was thinking before looking back when she had found the words. She told him more about her mother's death. A fever, like Margaret, which was a coincidence he noted but did not mention aloud. Her mother had been ill for 2 weeks and Lillian had been 16 and there had been no one else. Her father had already died when she was 10. And so Lillian had managed the household and nursed her mother and made every decision herself during those 2 weeks, and she had done it entirely without assistance. She said this without asking for admiration, just reporting it as the thing that had happened, but Clayton heard the full weight of it. "After she was gone," Lillian said, "I discovered that I was capable of managing things I had not known I could manage. It was not a comfort exactly, but it was a kind of knowledge." She turned her cup between her palms. "I think you know what I mean." "I do," Clayton said. "Clara knows it too," Lillian said. "She knows her own capacity. She is not going to need to be taken care of. She is going to need someone to keep up with her." Clayton looked at the door to the hallway where his daughter slept. "Yes," he said, "she is." Lillian looked at him with her gray eyes in the lamplight. "You are a good father." "I have been better," he said. "You are right now," she said. "Imperfectly and honestly right now. That is what counts." He found himself watching her hands around the coffee cup, the particular capable, unadorned quality of them, and he thought about the tomato plant she had brought inside, the one lopsided tomato she had eaten with salt on a Tuesday and declared a personal victory, and he thought that there was a version of courage in ordinary things that he had forgotten to see. "I would like you to stay longer than 3 days," he said, and then added immediately, "if you are willing, and if it suits your work schedule." Lillian was quiet for a moment. I have 2 more days before I am expected back for Monday classes, she said. 2 more days then, he said. 2 more days, she agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, the lamp burning between them, and outside the Kansas night was cold and huge and full of stars. On the 4th day, they rode out together to the far eastern boundary of the ranch, where a line of cottonwood trees stood along the creek, bare now in November, their white branches against the gray sky like something a painter might choose. Lillian had borrowed a horse from the Alderson ranch across the way, which Clayton had arranged the previous morning, and she sat a horse with the easy competence of someone who had ridden since childhood, another detail she had mentioned in one letter and that now translated into the actual physical reality of her. They stopped at the creek and let the horses drink. "I need to tell you something," Lillian said, looking at the water. He waited. "Gerald Voss is coming to Caldwell," she said. Clayton went still. "What do you mean?" She turned to look at him, and her expression was controlled, but underneath it was something harder and more brittle, the expression of a person who has just seen a problem reappear that they thought they had left behind. "I received a letter last week before I came here, from Mrs. Hartley, my colleague. She told me that Gerald has recently acquired land near Caldwell, part of a larger speculative purchase, and that he has been inquiring about me, about where I had gone. About who I had been writing to." Clayton looked at her. "He knew you were writing to me. I did not tell him. But Abilene is a small world in its way, and I had mentioned in passing to someone that I had responded to an advertisement from a rancher in Caldwell." She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. "I do not think it means anything serious, but I wanted you to know because I do not like surprises and I do not think you do either." "I do not," he agreed. "Gerald is not a dangerous man," she said carefully. "He is a petty one. There is a difference. He will likely say some unpleasant things if given the opportunity, and I wanted you to hear the background directly from me rather than from his version." "I appreciate that," Clayton said. She looked at him squarely. "I want to be very clear about something. I ended my connection with Gerald Voss entirely and willingly. He hurt my pride and my reputation and my trust, and I spent a year being angry about it, and then I decided to stop being angry because the anger was giving him more of my time than he deserved. He has no claim on me and no bearing on any decision I make." "I know," Clayton said. "I just want to make certain we are both clear," she said. "We are both clear," he said. She nodded once sharply and looked back at the creek, and he saw the tension in her shoulders settle a fraction, and he thought that she had been carrying that piece of news since before she arrived and had managed it alongside everything else with characteristic efficiency. "Lillian," he said. She looked at him. "I am glad you told me," he said. "I am also glad you came." Something in her face softened. "So am I," she said quietly. They rode back toward the ranch through the cold noon light, and the horses moved easily beside each other, and the land was broad and gray and beautiful in the particular austere way of the Kansas plains in November, and Clayton Brenner thought that he had not noticed the beauty of his own land in 4 months, and that noticing it again felt like recovering a faculty he had thought he had lost permanently. 2 days later, Lillian Barrett went back to Abilene on the afternoon stage. She stood beside the stage with her traveling bag and looked at him and Clara, who had both come to town together this time, both present and neither attempting to hide it. "I enjoyed meeting you very much, Miss Barrett," Clara said with a formal sincerity that was entirely genuine. "I enjoyed meeting you enormously, Clara," Lillian said. "You are exactly what your father described and also entirely your own person. Both things are true simultaneously." Clara absorbed this with visible satisfaction. Lillian turned to Clayton. They looked at each other in the November light of the Caldwell Street. "I will write," he said. "I know," she said. "I will write back immediately." "You have my full commitment on that point." He almost smiled. "I have improved in that area," he said. "You have," she agreed. "Dramatically." There was a moment in which they were close enough that he could see the gray of her eyes very clearly, and the cold wind was pulling at her coat, and he thought about reaching out and thought better of it, and she looked at him as though she knew exactly what he was thinking and was filing it away. She got on the stage. He watched it go. Clara slipped her hand into his as the stage disappeared around the bend at the end of the main street, and he looked down at her and she looked up at him. "Write to her tonight," Clara said. "I was going to write to her tonight," he said. "Just making sure," Clara said. They wrote to each other through November and December with an increasing frequency and an increasing honesty that had by now taken on its own particular warmth. The letters were not courtship in the formal sense. They were something more immediate, more like two people who had decided to know each other, and were doing so with a focused intensity that occasionally surprised even him, who was not by nature an intense man, or had not thought himself to be one. She wrote about the school play her students were rehearsing for Christmas, about the particular chaos of trying to get 14 girls between the ages of 8 and 15 to cooperate in a theatrical production, about the girl in her class named Hetty who had an extraordinary voice and no confidence, and Lillian's ongoing campaign to make her use it. She wrote about Gerald Voss having purchased land about 12 miles southwest of Caldwell, that she had this on good authority from Mrs. Hartley, and that she was noting it as information without particular alarm. Clayton noted it too, with slightly more than particular alarm, but he kept his response measured because she had already told him she had no interest in being the subject of a territorial dispute, and he respected that completely. He wrote about the cattle sales in late November, about the particular satisfaction of closing out a solid year on the books after the emotional catastrophe of the spring, about Pete Alderson's wife, Dorothea, who had brought a pie over one Sunday and stayed for 4 hours discussing politics with a passion that had impressed him considerably. He wrote about Clara's Christmas list, which was primarily books with one very specific request for a particular type of magnifying glass she had read about in a science pamphlet, which he was quietly in the process of trying to locate. He wrote, "I find that I am looking forward to your letters in a way that has become one of the primary structures of my week. I am aware that this is perhaps more than I intended to reveal, but I seem to have lost the habit of concealing things from you." Lillian wrote back, "I have the same experience. It is somewhat inconvenient for a person who has spent several years cultivating useful independence to discover that she is quite specifically looking forward to a letter from a cattle rancher in Caldwell, Kansas. I am managing the inconvenience." He wrote, "I would like you to come back for Christmas if that is possible, or if you prefer, I would like to come to Abilene. I leave the geography to your choice." She wrote back in 4 days, "Come to Abilene. I want you to see where I live before we go any further with this. I want you to see the whole picture." He arranged for Pete Alderson to watch the ranch for a long weekend, and he told Clara he was going to Abilene, and Clara looked at him with the expression of a person who had been anticipating this for several weeks. "Bring her back," Clara said. "I am going to visit," he said. "I am not going to her front door and demanding she come home with me." "I know," Clara said. "I still think you should bring her back." Clayton Brenner took the stage to Abilene on the 21st of December, 1882. Abilene was a different world from Caldwell, larger, busier, with the particular energy of a cattle town that was trying to grow beyond being a cattle town, the competing architectural ambitions of new brick storefronts and old wooden saloon facades. He knew the town slightly but had not been here in years, and he looked at it with new eyes, trying to see it as the place that had contained Lillian Barrett for the past 3 years. She met him at the stage depot herself, which he had not entirely expected. She was wearing a dark blue coat and a different hat from the traveling one, a better hat, not ostentatious but chosen, and she looked entirely herself in a way that made him feel, for the first time, that he was meeting her on her own ground rather than on his, which was interesting and slightly humbling. "Mr. Brenner," she said. "You could call me Clayton," he said. "We have written each other 37 letters. I know the count," she said, and there was that smile, the real one. "Clayton." She showed him Abilene with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, not as a tour guide but as a resident, pointing out the school where she worked with specific pride, the landlady's house where she rented her room, the small dry goods store where she bought her supplies. He saw the yard behind the rooming house, a small square of brown winter ground with a single clay pot that contained the survivors of the tomato enterprise, now fully dormant but kept anyway. "You kept the pot," he said. "I am keeping the pot," she said. "It will come back in spring." "You are certain?" "I am choosing to be certain," she said, with a firmness that was clearly a matter of personal principle. He met the landlady, Mrs. Copeland, a woman of 60 with the sharp eyes of someone who had been evaluating the company Lillian kept and was now evaluating him with efficient thoroughness. She seemed to reach a provisional conclusion that was not entirely negative, which he took as a success. On the evening of the 22nd, they had dinner at the hotel dining room, a nicer establishment than the ordinary everyday options, and he had put on his better coat for it, and she had changed into a green dress that was neither fancy nor plain, and which made her gray eyes look like winter sky. And they sat across a table with a white cloth and real candles, and ate a dinner that they both barely noticed because they were too busy talking. He asked her about the school board meeting she had mentioned in her last letter, the one about the curriculum. She described it with a controlled fury that lit her up from inside, the specific, targeted injustice of men who had never spent a day teaching deciding that the girls of Abilene needed less arithmetic and more domestic science, and Lillian's response to the board, which had been polite in its language and entirely uncompromising in its substance, and the vote which she had not won, but which she had come much closer to winning than anyone had expected. "You are going to win eventually," he said. "I know," she said. "It is only a question of how many meetings it takes." "Your certainty is remarkable," he said. "I choose my certainties carefully," she said, "and then I hold them." He looked at her across the candle. "Like the tomato plant," he said. "Like the tomato plant," she confirmed. The candlelight was warm on her face and her gray eyes were very clear, and he put down his fork and said, "Lillian, I want to ask you something directly." She looked at him steadily. "All right. I would like you to come to Caldwell not as a visitor," he said. "I would like to ask you to consider whether this is something you want to make permanent. I am not asking you to decide tonight, and I am not asking you to give up your work or your life here, because I would not ask that, and I do not think you would accept it if I did. But I am asking you whether what we have been building these past months is something you would want to build further, together, in the same place." The candle moved in a draft from somewhere and the light shifted on her face. "I have been thinking about it since November," she said, with characteristic directness. "And," he said, "and," she said, "I have decided that I trust the evidence. I have been writing to you for 6 months and you have been writing to me for 3. And what I know of you is, I believe, genuinely you, not performed, not arranged for my benefit, and what you know of me is genuinely me. And I believe that two people who know each other honestly are capable of building something real." "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is a yes," she said. He reached across the white tablecloth and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the candle-lit dining room of the Abilene Hotel on the 22nd of December, 1882, and it was not a fairy tale, and it was not simple, and it was entirely real. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, they walked through the center of Abilene together, and he bought Clara's magnifying glass from a science supply shop that Lillian knew about, which she had been saving as a suggestion for exactly this moment. And Lillian bought him a leather-bound notebook with good, thick pages, and he bought her a cutting of asparagus fern from a greenhouse that he found with some effort, to replace the one she had left at the rooming house since she was coming back to Caldwell with him. And she looked at the plant in his hands and then looked at him, and her eyes were bright. "When did you decide I was coming back with you?" she asked. "When you said yes," he said. "Approximately 20 seconds after. You move quickly for a man who did not open his mail for 4 months," she said. "I am making up for lost time," he said. She laughed, a full real laugh, the first time he had heard her laugh like that, and it was an extremely good sound. They arrived back in Caldwell on Christmas Day, which was perhaps not perfectly conventional, but was entirely appropriate given the specific nature of their story. And Clara met them at the door of the ranch house, with the expression of someone trying very hard not to look, as though she had been right all along. Clayton handed her the magnifying glass. Clara's face broke completely open with delight, every controlled composure of the past months dissolving for a single purely 12-year-old moment of joy, and she hugged him hard and then looked at Lillian with the glass already in her hand. "You knew he was looking for it," Clara said. "I happen to know where to find it," Lillian said. Clara looked at her father and then at Lillian and then back at her father. "You are going to marry her," she stated. "Clara," Clayton said. "I am simply naming the obvious," Clara said. Lillian was looking at the ground to hide a smile. Clayton could see the corners of it anyway. "I would appreciate," he said carefully, "if you would allow things to proceed at a reasonable pace." "The pace has been 6 months of letters," Clara said. "That seems reasonable to me." She was, he reflected, exactly as difficult as he had promised Lillian, and Lillian was looking at his daughter with an expression of profound appreciation. The months that followed were the process of 2 lives carefully and honestly being joined together. Lillian arranged to finish the school term in Abilene and returned to Caldwell at the end of January, 1883, staying initially at the home of Dorothea Alderson, Pete's wife, who had made it very clear to anyone who might have opinions about the situation that she considered Lillian Barrett an exceptional addition to the community, and who proved to be exactly the kind of steadfast, practical social ally that the situation required. There were people in Caldwell who had opinions. Small towns had opinions the way clouds had rain. There was some talk about the pace of things, about a widower moving forward so soon, though 14 months had passed since Margaret's death, and Clayton had spent 4 of them barely functional, which he did not consider to be moving quickly by any measure. He let the talk exist without engaging with it, and Lillian handled it in her own way, which was to be so consistently capable, honest, and useful that people eventually ran out of grounds for objection. She found a part-time teaching position at the Caldwell School within 3 weeks of arriving, which Mrs. Hartley had told her was available, which she had not mentioned to Clayton because she had done her research independently and come prepared. The school board in Caldwell had slightly more progressive views than Abilene's, or at least different ones, and she approached the arithmetic question with the same methodical long game that she had applied in Abilene. Gerald Voss did come to Caldwell in February, as the rumors had suggested he might. He came to the general store on a Tuesday morning when Lillian happened to be there buying lamp oil and flour. She saw him across the store before he saw her. He was heavier than she remembered, and he had the look of a man who had made some money and expected it to precede him into every room. He saw her a moment after she saw him, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession, the last one settling into a species of charm that she recognized with clarity as the thing she had once found appealing and now found precisely empty. "Lillian," he said, coming toward her. "You look well." "Gerald," she said. He started to say something about what a coincidence, how strange life was, perhaps implying an opening for a conversation she had absolutely no interest in having. She let him get through 2 sentences, then said, "I hope your land purchase goes well, Gerald. I'm otherwise occupied. Good day." She bought her lamp oil and her flour and left the store. She told Clayton about it that evening over dinner, the 3 of them at the kitchen table, in the same direct, factual way she told him anything that was relevant information. "He tried to speak to you," Clayton said. "He tried to," Lillian confirmed. "I did not encourage it." "Did he say anything objectionable?" "He did not have the opportunity," she said. "I was not interested in giving him an audience." Clayton looked at her across the table and felt the particular satisfaction of watching a person handle their own demons with complete competence. "He is not going to be a problem," Lillian said with a certainty she clearly had decided to hold. "No," Clayton agreed. "He is not." Gerald Voss did not prove to be a problem. He came into Caldwell occasionally over the following months as his land business required, and he and Lillian occupied the same town, with a mutual blank disregard that was in its own way a complete resolution. He did not cause trouble. He was, as she had said, a petty man and not a dangerous one, and petty men, denied an audience, generally find other things to do with their energy. Clayton proposed to Lillian on a Sunday in March, 1883, beside the creek where the cottonwood trees were just beginning to show the first green of their spring leaves. He had been thinking about how to do it for several weeks with an attention that slightly amused him, given that he was not generally a man who spent weeks planning the form of things. He had finally decided that the form did not matter as much as the honesty, and that the honest thing was to say exactly what he meant without architecture or ceremony. He said, "Lillian, I want to marry you. I want you to be here with me and Clara, and I want to build the rest of this life in the same direction as you. I am not going to tell you I am an uncomplicated man, or that this is an uncomplicated situation, but I think we have established that neither of us requires simplicity. I think we require honesty and work in someone who does not look away from the full version of things, and I think we are both those things for each other. Will you marry me?" Lillian stood beside the spring creek with the cottonwood leaves behind her and looked at him with her gray eyes very clear and said, "Yes, Clayton, I will marry you." He reached out and took her hand, and she stepped forward and put her free hand against his chest, and he put his other arm around her, and they stood together in the new spring light by the creek on his father's land, and it was exactly as real and imperfect and good as he had thought it might be. They told Clara that evening. Clara received the news with the expression of a person who had decided this outcome 4 months ago and was simply gratified that the rest of the world had caught up. She hugged Lillian first, then her father, and then set her jaw in the particular way she had when she was thinking through logistics. "The guest room," she said. "What about it?" Clayton said. "It will need to be a proper room," Clara said. "Not a guest room, a room for Lillian." "I believe that is correct," Lillian said gravely. "I am going to help decide how to arrange it," Clara announced. "I would like that," Lillian said entirely seriously. "Also," Clara said, looking between them, "I would like a sibling eventually. I am just putting that out in advance so you know." Clayton looked at the ceiling. Lillian looked at the ceiling also, then looked back at Clara with the calm face she had learned to deploy with 12 years of teaching. "Duly noted," she said. They were married in May of 1883 at the church in Caldwell, on a Saturday when the wildflowers were exactly at their peak. It was a small ceremony, practical and honest, the way everything between them was. Pete and Dorothea Alderson were there, and 2 of Lillian's colleagues from the Caldwell School, and the minister who had come to know both of them over the preceding months and who seemed genuinely pleased to be conducting the service. Clara stood beside her father during the ceremony with her magnifying glass in her dress pocket, which Clayton had not known until he heard the faint sound of it when she shifted her weight. And he had looked at her, and she had given him the smallest smile. And he had looked at Lillian, who was standing in front of him in a dress of gray-blue that matched her eyes and was in no way ostentatious, and was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a very long time. And he said his vows with a steadiness that surprised him, the steadiness of a man who has made a decision from an honest place and knows it. Lillian said her vows with the same steadiness, and when she said them her gray eyes were on his face with that direct, complete quality, the same quality that had been in every letter she had ever written, and he thought that he had been right about her from the first letter, that her honesty was the thing she had come to give and the thing he had most needed to receive. They were married. The ranch in those first months of their marriage was a different place. Not unrecognizable, not transformed, but warmer. Lillian was not Margaret and had no interest in being Margaret, and she made that clear in the way she moved through the house, not replacing things but adding her own layer to them. The asparagus fern on the kitchen windowsill, the school papers she graded at the kitchen table in the evenings, the particular brand of humor she brought to the ordinary disasters of ranch life. The time the water pump broke in June, and she stood ankle-deep in the resulting mud looking at it, with a calmness that Clayton found more helpful than any amount of agitation would have been. She continued teaching. She won the arithmetic vote at the school board in October, by one vote, having spent 5 months methodically making her arguments to individual board members with the same patient certainty she applied to everything. She came home that evening and sat down at the kitchen table and put her head briefly in her hands in a gesture of pure exhausted relief that was so unguarded and so real that Clayton went around the table and put his hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and covered his hands with hers. "You won," he said. "I won," she said. "And Hetty?" he asked, knowing the answer from her previous letters about the girl with the extraordinary voice. "Hetty sang in the Christmas concert last year," Lillian said, "and she is going to sing again this year, and she has started composing her own songs, which is entirely beyond anything I had hoped for." She paused. Sometimes a small thing opens everything. Clayton thought about a pile of unopened letters in a crate. "Yes," he said, "sometimes it does." Clara turned 13 in the summer of their first married year, and she was reading at a level that her teachers at the Caldwell School occasionally had difficulty keeping pace with, which Lillian addressed by bringing her books from Abilene when she visited her former colleagues, and by having long conversations with Clara over breakfast that Clayton sometimes simply listened to, feeling the particular luxury of a house where ideas moved through the rooms like weather. Clara and Lillian had found their particular kind of friendship, not the replacing of a mother but something new, a compact between two intelligent women who respected each other's intelligence, a relationship Clayton had simply stayed out of the way of and let develop on its own terms, which had been exactly the right approach. In the spring of 1884, Lillian told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table before Clara was up, in the same direct way she told him anything, sitting across from him with her coffee and saying, "I need to tell you something." He had put down his cup. She told him. Sat with it for a moment, and then he looked at her face, which was careful and trying to read him, and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling entirely fine," she said. "The mornings are not perfectly comfortable, but it is manageable." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Good," he said. "That is good, Lillian." Her face opened. "You are pleased," she said with a kind of relief in it. "I am very pleased," he said. She squeezed his hand. "I thought you would be," she said. "I was only a little nervous." "You were nervous about telling me," he said. "I am not perfectly impervious to nervousness," she said, "despite all evidence." He moved his chair around the table and she turned to face him, and he took both her hands and said, "Whatever you need, whatever is hardest, tell me." "You always say that," she said. "I always mean it," he said. Clara came down for breakfast 20 minutes later and looked between them with 12 months of sharp observation behind her 14-year-old eyes. "Something has happened," she said. They told her. Clara sat down very slowly. Then she looked at Lillian and then at her father and then at some middle distance where she appeared to be processing at high speed. "I mentioned wanting a sibling," she said finally. "You did," Lillian confirmed. "This is exactly what I asked for," Clara said. "It is," Clayton said. Clara nodded once sharply, with the expression of a person whose operational planning has proven itself entirely sound. The pregnancy went well through the summer and into the fall of 1884. Lillian continued teaching into September, which raised eyebrows, and met those raised eyebrows with the equanimity of a woman who had dealt with far more significant obstacles and was not going to adjust her professional life because of other people's discomfort. She stopped teaching in October, which was her choice, and spent the last 2 months of her pregnancy reading vast quantities, corresponding with Mrs. Hartley about school board matters in Abilene, helping Clara with advanced mathematics that had outpaced the Caldwell School, and being occasionally driven to impatience by the enforced slowness of the situation. "I'm not built for sitting still," she told Clayton one October evening. "You are not," he agreed. "I find it extremely frustrating," she said. "I know," he said. "You are doing it remarkably well despite finding it frustrating." She looked at him over her book. "That is a very diplomatic thing to say." "I am learning," he said. She threw a pillow at him, which he caught, and she laughed, and the sound of her laugh in the warm October house was one of the best things he knew. Their son was born on the 14th of November, 1884, on a cold, clear evening when the Kansas stars were out in full. He was healthy and loud and had Lillian's dark hair, which appeared immediately and in abundance, and Clayton held him in the lamplight of the bedroom while the doctor finished his work and Lillian watched from the bed with exhausted, clear, specific gray eyes. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, looking at his son. "He is very opinionated," Lillian said. "He has been practicing that noise." "He has your lungs," Clayton said. "He has my everything at the moment," she said. "He will need to develop his own things. He can start tomorrow." Clayton brought the baby to her, and she took him with the same quality of focused attention she brought to everything, looking at him with complete seriousness, and then softening all at once in a way she usually did not allow in public, and which was one of the things he loved most about being trusted with the private version of her. Clara came in after a few minutes and stood at the bedside and looked at her brother with an expression so mixed and layered, 12 different things at once, love and curiosity and awe and a kind of fierce protectiveness she had not known she was carrying until this moment. "He is very small," she said. "He will not always be," Lillian said. "What is his name?" Clara asked. Lillian looked at Clayton. They had discussed names for months with all the thoroughness they brought to anything important. "Samuel," Clayton said. "Samuel James Brenner." Clara looked at her brother. "Samuel," she said, testing it. "Hello, Samuel." Samuel, being 1 hour old, expressed himself at high volume. Clara laughed, a real unguarded laugh, the laugh of a girl who has stopped being afraid of being unguarded, and the sound of it filled the warm, lamplit room, and Clayton Brenner stood in the middle of his life, in the house his father had built, with his daughter laughing and his wife and his new son before him, and he thought about a crate of letters in a study, unopened for 4 months, and a girl who had wept over a single page, and a man who had been trying to turn to stone. And the way one honest letter from a stranger had found its way through all of that and changed everything. He thought about Lillian writing her 4th letter into silence, keeping faith with something she could not even verify existed. He thought about the tomato plant. He thought about chosen certainties and how they grew. In the years that followed, the Brenner Ranch continued to prosper, through the changing fortunes of the cattle industry and the difficult drought years of the mid-1880s and the slow, grinding transformations of the Kansas plains, as the frontier gave way to something more settled and more complicated. The years were not without hardship. There were seasons when the rain did not come, and the pastures browned, and the decisions about the herd were the kind of decisions that kept a man awake in the dark listening to the wind. There were years when the market turned against the ranchers, and Clayton worked the ranch at a loss and had to make hard cuts and harder choices. Lillian worked alongside him through all of it, not in a supporting role, but as a full partner, with her characteristic combination of clear analysis and chosen optimism. When the drought year came in 1887, and they had to sell half the cattle herd to preserve the breeding stock, it was Lillian who sat down with the account books and laid out the strategy with the same methodical precision she brought to winning school board votes, and her plan was sound and they came through it. And in 1888 the rains returned and the herd rebuilt. She kept teaching through all of it, part-time when the children were small, full-time when they were older, and she eventually became the head of the Caldwell School's upper division, which was a position that the school board had not actually created before she pointed out it should exist. She built the arithmetic curriculum she had always intended to build, and she added geography and basic natural philosophy, and she fought every fight she needed to fight with the same patient certainty, and she won more than she lost. Clara grew up with the same fierce intelligence she had always had and left for Topeka at 18 to attend the teachers' college where Lillian had some connections and excellent recommendations to offer. She was going to become a teacher, which surprised no one, and she left with her magnifying glass and a trunk full of books and a goodbye that lasted 20 minutes at the door of the ranch house because neither she nor her father could entirely manage to end it. Lillian stood beside Clayton as the wagon disappeared down the road with Clara in it, and she put her arm through his. "She is going to be magnificent," Lillian said. "She already is," he said. "She gets it from both of you," she said. He looked at her. "From me and her mother," he said carefully. "From you and her mother, and also from having me in the house for 5 years and absorbing things whether she intended to or not," Lillian said, with her small, real smile. "That is also true," he said. Samuel was 4 when Clara left for Topeka, and he was growing into a curious, energetic boy who had his mother's gray eyes and directness and his father's physical ease in the world, and who followed Clayton around the ranch with an attentiveness that suggested he was already filing away everything he saw for later use. He asked questions constantly, which Lillian encouraged, and Clayton answered with whatever accuracy he could manage. And when he did not know something, he said so, which Lillian had told him was the most important thing a parent could model. Their second child, a girl they named Margaret Rose, was born in 1887, and she was from her earliest moments a different person than her brother, quieter and more observational, watching the world from large gray-brown eyes with a patience that seemed extraordinary in an infant. Lillian said she got it from Clayton, the capacity to go still and observe. Clayton said she got it from Lillian, the capacity to notice everything without requiring it to change immediately. "We are both right," Lillian said. "We usually are," he agreed. "We are also occasionally completely wrong about individual things," she said. "Also true," he said. Margaret Rose grew into the patient, observant person she had promised to be from the beginning, with a particular love for the natural world, for the birds of the Kansas plains, for the plants she grew in careful rows in the garden with a thoroughness that Lillian observed with great satisfaction and zero claim to genetic credit, though everyone who knew her saw it entirely. On an evening in the fall of 1889, Clayton sat on the front porch of the ranch house after dinner, in the last light of a September afternoon that looked remarkably like the September afternoon 7 years earlier when Clara had opened a letter and wept, and thought about what he would say if someone asked him how his life had come to look the way it did. He would say, "My daughter opened a letter." He would say, "I sat down and read the rest." He would say, "A woman named Lillian Barrett wrote me 4 letters while I was not paying attention, and each one was more honest than the last, and when I finally picked them up, the honesty in them was enough to pull a man out of the bottom of something very deep." The screen door opened and Lillian came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him in the other chair, and the Kansas evening was enormous and orange, and the cattle in the west field were settling, and the windmill was turning in the light wind, and Samuel was somewhere in the barn, probably doing something Clayton would hear about later, and Margaret Rose was on the parlor floor with a book about birds. He took the coffee cup. He looked at his wife in the September light. "What are you thinking?" she asked, in the easy way she asked now that they had 7 years of evenings to build on. "I am thinking about letters," he said. She understood immediately because she always did. 4 months of unopened mail," she said. 4 letters from a stranger," he said. 3 letters from a stranger," she corrected. "You wrote the 4th. "I thought the silence was the 4th, he said. She looked at him with her gray eyes, 7 years older and more entirely themselves, and she was smiling. "You remembered that." "I remember everything you say," he told her. "Not everything," she said. "Most things," he said. "The important things." She looked out at the Kansas evening. "I am glad you read them," she said. "Eventually." "I am glad you wrote them," he said. Into silence. "Someone had to," she said. The wind moved through the buffalo grass and the sun went lower, and the sky turned from orange to a deep rose, and then to the particular blue of Kansas dusk, and they sat together on the porch of the house his father had built, with the sound of their children inside, and the cattle and the windmill and the enormous familiar land, and the evening settled around them like a thing that had been there all along, only waiting to be inhabited. He reached over and took her hand. She turned her palm up and held his. The stars came out over Caldwell, Kansas, one by one in the deepening dark, and the lamp in the parlor window made a warm square of light against the night. And Clayton Brenner sat with his wife on his porch and thought about letters and silence, and the things that find their way through both when the person writing them is brave enough to keep writing, and the person receiving them is finally ready to read. In the kitchen, in the drawer of his writing desk, there were still 4 letters in their envelopes, the original 4. He had kept them, as she had kept the tomato pot. Some things you keep not because they are useful, but because they are true, because they represent the moment when something turned, when the world rearranged itself around a new possibility, and everything after became different. Clara wrote from Topeka every week, long detailed letters full of her studies and her arguments with professors who underestimated her and her friendships and her observations about the world. Letters that were so entirely her that reading them was like having her at the kitchen table. She would finish her teaching degree in the spring, and she had written that she was considering coming back to Caldwell to teach, which was not the only path but was the one that currently called to her. And Clayton had written back that the Caldwell school would be very fortunate, and that her room was her room whenever she needed it. Samuel started school in September, and his teacher, a young woman named Miss Porter who had trained under Lillian's supervision, reported that he was exceptionally bright and also exceptionally determined to have conversations during arithmetic instruction, which the class enjoyed but which required some management. Lillian heard this report with the expression of a woman receiving entirely expected news about a situation she had complete information about. "He argues with your logic," she told Clayton that evening. "His own mind is very fast and he wants to test it constantly." "He gets that from you," Clayton said. "He gets the speed from me," she said. "He gets the stubbornness from you." "Probably," he said. Margaret Rose looked up from her bird book. "He gets the loudness from nobody," she said, with the precision of a 6-year-old who had been collecting evidence. "He just made that himself." Clayton and Lillian looked at each other, and the kitchen was full of the kind of laughter that belongs to a family that has learned each other all the way through, that has built enough history together to have its own language of small moments and shared references. The laughter of people who have chosen to know each other honestly, and have discovered that honesty, in a house with enough warmth in it, is the funniest and best thing of all. Outside, the fall wind came down through the cottonwoods along the creek and set the windmill turning, and the cattle settled in the pasture, and the stars of a Kansas night came out sharp and clear over the Brenner ranch. And inside the house there was lamplight and laughter and coffee and the smell of a good supper. And 4 months of grief were 7 years behind them, and every letter had been answered, and every silence had been filled. And the life that had begun with a weeping girl and a crate of unopened mail had grown into something large and true and deeply, ordinarily, perfectly good.